Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing AMD's Financial Analyst Day event. This event lasted several hours, and there was an awful lot of expectation and hype going into it. What exactly were AMD going to announce, and would there be any surprise attendance from either Sony or Microsoft? Well, the answer is that the event certainly did not disappoint. They unveiled a plethora of different products, everything from the data center all the way to games consoles and ultra-thin portable notebooks, and of course we also learned a lot of plans for the desktop. Honestly, this event was several hours in length, so I just cannot cover everything in this video for time's sake. But what I will do is focus on elements that I think the audience is going to be most interested in. So we're going to discuss, well, desktop graphics, processors, and so on, as well as a few things for the server market. So, with that said, let's start out with the GPU plans. So AMD confirmed what I've leaked for about a year now actually, and that is that they are going to be bifurcating their GPU lineup. There is going to be CDNA, which stands for Compute DNA, that is of course going to be for the data center, and then they're also going to have another series of graphics cards which is going to be based on RDNA 2, and unsurprisingly the codename for RDNA 2 is Navi 2X. So with this particular series of GPUs, there will be a plethora of improvements, not least of which is going to be ray tracing support and variable rate shading. So let's start out with the architecture roadmap. Currently, we're on the RDNA first generation architecture, which is architecture optimized for gaming. This will be followed up with RDNA 2, performance per watt improvements, ray tracing, variable rate shading, and more. And then in the future, by 2022, we will see RDNA 3 launch. This is something that I actually did disclose in a video, that I was super aware that AMD were internally working on RDNA 3, although, as you would expect, it is not as far in development as RDNA 2. RDNA 2 does have numerous improvements, though, to the actual fundamental architecture. And one of the slides that really demonstrates this was AMD RDNA 2 performance per watt improvement, building on proven CPU design methodology. And you can see here that there's microarchitecture innovation, which is improvements per clock, IPC, reduced complexity and switching power, and also physical optimization, which is increasing the clock frequency. If you're a regular viewer, you will know that this is actually something I did leak, that from my understanding, AMD were taking what they'd learnt with the Zen processor architecture, and then basically bringing that in to the second generation of RDNA, which was leading to a drastic reduction in power consumption, but the team are also targeting a higher clock frequency. As of the time that I'm recording this video, I don't know how much of an improvement there is in terms of clock frequency, but honestly, given the performance per clock improvements, we'll get into that in a moment, as well as just having more compute units to bring to the task, a modest performance increase just from the clock frequency alone will be pretty profound. Even if they can bring 100, 200 megahertz to the equation, it will make quite the difference. Continuing with the performance per watt side of the equation, they also state that there's a 50% improvement here. And I'd heard that there was quite a large jump between RDNA 1 and RDNA 2. Once again, this is something that I'd covered several times on the channel based upon my sources, but I will be really honest with you, I did not expect such a significant increase as this. I thought maybe about half of this, so I guess you could say 25%, not 50%. Understand, they are not talking about IPC gains here. They are not referring to that. Instead, they are referring purely to performance per watt. But this is definitely a really good sign of it. They did not disclose exactly what is changing in the architecture to accommodate such a drastic increase in performance per watt. We can assume it's going to be things like the improvement, in the node. Rumor is that we're going to be seeing it on 7nm+. But furthermore, the architecture itself, from what I understand, is also improved quite significantly. I have heard that there's a massive overhaul to the caching system of RDNA 2. I don't know figures. I've just been told that the cache of the GPU is larger and more efficient. And I've also been told that the way the compute units themselves function has received an overhaul. I'd love to give you more insight to this, but a couple of things I do know I've been asked to keep quiet on, and I'm also in the dark in many areas for RDNA 2, so your guess is as good as mine in many areas. We can also see, however, that hardware-accelerated ray tracing has been really emphasized, and there's a scene there that was allegedly generated in real time by Navi 2X or RDNA 2 or whatever you want to call it. Common architecture for PCs and consoles that simplify development and speed adoption and maximizing performance with low-level API. Interestingly enough, during the Financial Analyst Day conference, there was a couple of sentences which basically emphasized the fact that Microsoft and AMD were working quite closely together with the DXR 1.1. I had said a couple of times previously that I would have been shocked if RDNA 2 was not indicative of the DXR 1.1 standard, because obviously, I'm going to say something pretty obvious here, but Microsoft have a great deal of control to the DirectX standard, and clearly they were making some of those changes in preparation for the next generation Xbox. So to me, things such as variable rate shading being included in the next generation of RDNA, as well as ray tracing support and yada yada yada, were just pretty obvious. I will also say though that back in March of last year, I was told that the second generation of RDNA would feature, well back then of course it was just known as Navi, would feature ray tracing, but even up until now, I still don't know how good Navi's ray tracing capabilities are. I've heard everything from it's as good, if not better, than Nvidia's current solution, down to it's just kind of okay. So obviously AMD are still trying to bring that up, most likely, and we can just wait and see. There's probably going to be at least some efficiency improvements simply because of DXR 1.1, but I am referring to similar workloads with the same type of code, but obviously how Nvidia with their code handles things compared to this is probably going to be a little bit different anyway. I want to touch on data center stuff in a moment, but there are a couple of other slides that I really want to bring your attention to. The first is RDNA 2 Navi 2X next generation AMD GPUs, enthusiast class performance, extreme performance with efficient power, top of the stack GPUs with uncompromising 4K gaming, and once again reiterating that this hardware based ray tracing, variable rate shading, yada yada yada. And we can also see that in the roadmap, they do state that advanced node for RDNA 3, which I find interesting, because when it comes to the future Zen processors, they specifically pointed out the node that they were going to be using. So I find it interesting that here they've just said advanced node. So I'm kind of curious why that decision's made. I'll try to do some investigation. Another thing that was kind of stated by AMD is that they were looking to disrupt gaming performance with their GPUs. And they said that they want to be basically top of the pile, much like they are with, let's say, the data center CPUs. I would be very interested to know if this matches up to the whole Nvidia killer. As you will probably be aware if you're a regular viewer of the channel, one of my sources did tell me that Navi 2X, he believes that 23 is the larger of the SKUs, is what AMD are internally referring to as the Nvidia killer. And allegedly, through some other people that I'm hearing things from, Nvidia are actually a little concerned with how RDNA 2 is coming up. They didn't expect it to be quite this good, and that's allegedly one of the reasons that Nvidia have kind of slowed down the release of their next generation GPUs. I honestly have no idea how true that is, so I would take that with lots of salt. But I don't think Nvidia want to get caught with their pants down. They probably want to have an understanding of what exactly AMD are going to be bringing to the table. Now understand, this is not going to be like a redesign necessarily of GeForce 30 because it's a bit late for that, so they can't really add a ton of features at this point. But what Nvidia can do, of course, is decide to release higher spec versions of these SKUs. So for example, they could say, well, we're going to increase the number of CUDA cores across the SKUs, or we could increase bandwidth by, let's say, raising memory frequencies or what have you. With that said, I am very curious to see what Nvidia bring to the table. As much as Intel definitely got caught with its pants down, and I wish they didn't, because that would only be good for us as end users, to be honest. Nvidia just don't usually get caught out so much as what we've seen here with Intel. Of course, as always, we can only just wait and watch this space. Switching back to the compute stuff, however, currently AMD are using GCN, which is basically Vega for the data center, and they're going to move over to CDNA. As I also said, one of my sources quite a long time ago told me that AMD are going to be bifurcating its product offerings, one for the data center, and then of course a gaming variant. From what we know about CDNA, it is essentially Arcturus. I've gone extensively into Arcturus numerous times before on the channel, so I'm going to keep things brief here because we have so much to discuss, and I think most of you watching this are not going to want to be kind of given lots of information about a data center product. Maybe I'm wrong, and if I am there, I apologize. You can give me an email or a poke on Twitter, and I will go into it more extensively. But basically, we are looking at 7nm, which is going to see the second generation of AMD Infinity, and this we'll go more into the Infinity stuff in a moment because it's super interesting, at least in my opinion. And this is optimized for machine learning, high-performance computing. And then there will be a follow-up architecture, CDNA2, which once again will see an improvement to the connectivity with AMD Infinity. And this will extend to exascale. From what I understand about Arcturus, and credit to multiple people for telling me some of this stuff, including Rogame and Komachi, so all credit goes to them here, at least with the specifications. From what I understand, we're looking at up to 128 compute units, which is quite monstrous, and a crap ton, that's an official technical term, of high bandwidth memory too. I have been told that this GPU is ginormous. I don't have specifications on the die size, I would love to tell you. I've heard that RDNA 2, the largest of them, is like 500-ish mm squared. I've heard slightly more, slightly less from multiple different people, whereas with Arcturus, I've been told by one person it was so big that for some time they thought it was multiple dies. And another person told me that it was, quote, pushing the reticle limits, end quote. So yeah, this thing is going to be pretty darn big. I'm hearing its performance is pretty darn monstrous, and this is probably one of the reasons that the leaked GPUs that we've seen from Nvidia are just so many CUDA cores. We saw one, of course, recently that was discovered with almost 8,000 CUDA cores. I'm then going to move over to the data center software, RADEON Open Compute Platform, and there is a super duper interesting slide here, which is scalability. Scale multiple GPU performance leveraging Infinity architecture, which is on the right there. And you can see that what essentially is happening is all of the different GPUs can chat to one another. And this is also carried on with an AMD Infinity architecture roadmap. We can see that the third generation of AMD Infinity architecture, the CPUs can talk to one another, but the GPUs as well can intercommunicate. And basically this means that all devices essentially have a massive pool of memory. So let's just assume that you have like 8 GPUs running together, cuddling one another, and each of those GPUs has like 32 gigabytes of memory. All of that memory will basically be addressable, in one massive memory pool, and the CPUs as well can kind of chip in as necessary. And this was something else that someone hinted to me, that while Arcturus and the future MI GPUs from AMD are very impressive, the actual, I don't want to say key, because that would be underselling the architecture of the GPU, but a really major point, let's say, is the actual communication between those GPUs. And this is the age-old thing. It's like, it doesn't matter how good of a processor something is, if it cannot share or get data, or there's lots of latency between communication, then its usefulness in certain scenarios gets heavily reduced. And the final thing I'd like to discuss before moving on to the gaming side of things is the AMD leadership packaging. Back in 2015, we of course saw AMD introduce the high bandwidth memory GPUs, which was the Radeon Fury cards, which were pretty impressive, albeit with some limitations. The 4GB memory on board, even for 2015, was a bit of a kick in the shin. But the technology itself was interesting. And it did also bring some major improvements, not least of which, of course, is reduced power consumption. Then we saw, and they're mostly focused on the data center here, but of course much of this could also be inferred for the Threadripper processors. There you go. Brainfart.com. Anyway. So the first generation of EPYCs had, of course, 4 modules on them, which brought you the 32 cores, and each of those modules were 8 cores each. But there was quite a lot of latency there. Then the next generation, Rome, which is what we're on now, we can see that indeed there are 8 different clusters of CPU cores. Each one, of course, houses 8 CPUs, or up to 8 CPUs. And then in the middle, providing the communication, is the I/O die. But in the future, they haven't specified a date, and no, this is not going to be coming at the end of this year. It's the X3D packaging. They haven't really provided a whole ton of information, but it looks to me like the center is basically the compute dies, and then it's kind of a hybrid between the 2.5D packaging and the 3D packaging, and they are stating that it has up to 10 times the bandwidth of what we currently have, which is pretty damn profound and is extremely exciting for the future. But I think that's about it for the data center, because, well, I don't want that to eat up an inordinate amount of time for this. And now, a small update as well. This is literally a last-minute thing that I'm adding at the very end of recording, and I like to extend my thanks to Rogame on Twitter for this one, as he did put in an awful lot of work, so please go ahead and thank him in the comments for this. But this is something that he told me a while ago, and he and I have been discussing AMD's roadmap and some other bits and pieces in DM. And anyway, he had told me that he had some interesting information with Navi 22, 23, and 12. According to him, if AMD has the same pattern, I've got his tweet on the screen because it's way easier for you to read it than me to read all of that out. But basically, he believes that there's 4 consumer cards and 3 pro cards coming for Navi 12. For Navi 22, there's 4 pro cards, and 23, there's 2 pro cards and 7 consumer cards. He also said that the revision pattern can most likely be seen in the last generations for Vega 10, 20, and 1X. So he does believe that there's potentially some GPUs which do not follow this pattern. So this is my speculation on this, and I could be wrong. but I believe some of these cards potentially could be for Apple. So if you go back once again to March of last year, one of the things I was told was that AMD would have certain cards for Nave which would be for professional usage, although, as always, I had not all of the information back then. But one thing you can tell with Apple is that they obviously want the fastest GPUs possible. AMD are their GPU provider of choice because Nvidia and Apple are basically throwing stones at one another at the moment, and I'm not going to go into that relationship. I think they need to see like a marriage counsellor or something. But, getting back to what I'm saying here, I personally believe that Apple most likely will benefit heavily from this because, as we all know, Apple Macs are very well used in creative environments. So I personally believe there's a very good chance that one of the beneficiaries for all of this would be Apple. I don't know the specs of the GPUs offhand, so I don't know as well how the Pro versions of the cards compare against the consumer versions of the cards. In other words, what are the differences in specifications, capabilities? Unfortunately, I can't tell you that information. I do have a couple of other updates to this that I've been asked to not discuss quite yet. So, I guess the only thing I can say is stick with me, and I'll do my darndest, my gosh darndest, to keep you apprised. So one question that we hoped to have answered when the conference was over was what would be the RDNA version in the PlayStation 5, or at least could we learn something more about the architecture in both consoles? Quite frankly, I had very low expectation for any questions to be answered, unless the rumours of, let's say, Phil Spencer or Mark Cerny attending the conference were true. And I was very skeptical that they were true, to be totally honest, as I covered in a recent news video with the rumours that were circulating around. But I have been tagged numerous times and asked what my opinion is regarding the architecture inside the PlayStation 5. And I'm going to give you a shorter answer in this video because, quite frankly, I'm working on a larger piece of analysis regarding this fact. So I would encourage you to check that video out, so subscribe obviously if you want that content. But there's a couple of things. One, when it comes to the GPUs inside of a console, it's very much a custom design. So what I mean by that is that when it comes to the desktop, generations mean an awful lot more. For example, if you look at the difference between, let's say, Polaris and the RX 480 versus Vega, there was a clear, distinct difference in the feature set and the architecture from both GPUs. Whereas, with Sony and the PlayStation 4 Pro, it looked very much like Polaris in many ways. But there were some inherent differences. For one, it did include features like Rapid Packed Math, which was a feature which was actually from Vega. So what I'm basically saying is that GPU generations mean a lot less when it comes to consoles. The second fact is that Sony, as well as Microsoft, but I'm going to focus on Sony here for a moment, really like to customize their GPU. Look at when the PS4 first came out, for example. We saw features in it like volatile bit, which wasn't present in desktop GPUs. We saw an increase in the number of asynchronous compute engines and commands that the GPU could run, and so on and so on. And yes, you can also trace the origins of those GPUs back to a desktop variant, but almost invariably, Sony do customize the GPU. Now, from what all of my understanding is, Sony have features on their GPU like variable rate shading. They may call it something different in the end, but ultimately the feature set is really similar. Just like variable rate shading, hardware accelerated ray tracing is almost certainly present on the PlayStation 5's GPU. And from everything that I've been told, the features of RDNA 2, essentially the most important ones, are going to be present on the GPU of the PlayStation 5. So it doesn't really matter what the GPU architecture or the GPU codename of the PlayStation 5 is, because most likely it could have a base of RDNA 1, but Sony have, just like Microsoft, a really good understanding of what AMD's roadmap would be. This is not something like they're like, oh, RDNA 2's coming along. We totally didn't know about that. No, AMD would have told Sony and they would have told Microsoft about RDNA 1, they would have told them about RDNA 2, and also the plans for RDNA 3, so that a company could request certain features or certain additions for their particular GPUs and they can customize them to a degree. Now, I am vastly simplifying this for this video. I will be going much deeper into this in a separate video, so if you want to know about that stuff in a much greater detail, then I'd encourage you to check that video out. But for this video, I want to keep things as simple as possible, and there are a couple of technical things I'm really washing over here, but I want to keep things as simple as possible so as many people as possible, wow, that was a terrible sentence, can understand where I'm coming from. Finishing off with the whole console side of the equation, I believe that both systems are going to be immensely powerful, and I think there are going to be a lot of similarities between the GPUs. With that said, I also believe that both console manufacturers are probably going to have custom enhancements to their GPUs, just like we saw with the previous generation. So, to my mind anyway, when it comes to the GPUs inside these systems, you should really think of it more, not necessarily in terms of the generation of GPU, but instead think of it more in terms of feature set. I've also been asked by a variety of people my opinion regarding ray tracing and the impact of the previous generation. You may recall that recently I had an interview with AdShare. Local Ray, which is the product that they're producing, basically enables you to run ray tracing on a turnip. Obviously, depending on the GPU that is available, the quality of ray tracing will differ, and it does have a performance impact. If you missed the interview, I would encourage you heavily to search for it on the channel, or just search Red Gaming Tech, AdShare, ADSHIR, or you could search Local Ray, and it will pop up. But a lot of people are wondering if that is going to be used for the PS5, and I'm almost certain the answer is no. Because Reuven, who is the CEO of the company, when I was interviewing him, actually did provide a hint, and he actually said that imagine, I don't remember the exact quote, I'm an idiot and I forgot to put it up, but it was something like, just imagine what it could do running on a older generation console. And they do have a contract with a console vendor, but they cannot reveal which vendor it is. Now, I'm guessing here. I am not saying this in a position of knowledge, so I could totally be wrong, and if it is, I'm sorry. But I'm guessing that it's more likely to be Microsoft that are tasking this for the Xbox. And the reason is because Microsoft made the pledge to have games runnable on the Xbox One X, whereas Sony, and I'm basing this once again on information we have now, Sony seems to want to just kind of cut the generation a lot easier, or basically have more of a delimitation between one generation and the other, but they do have, of course, backwards compatibility. That also raises a whole separate set of questions regarding how titles will run on the Xbox One X, mostly on the CPU side of the equation, to be honest, in terms of, let's say, physics. But I believe that if what Reuven said is accurate, and it is only one vendor, it could be both, but if it is only one vendor, I believe it's more likely to be Microsoft, because they've made the pledge that they want games like Halo Infinite to run on the Xbox One X as well. So, employing something like AdShare on Halo Infinite to be able to run on the GPU would be one way around the problem, but I honestly do not know, A, how good it is in relation to, let's say, how RDNA 2 would function, B, I'm basing this purely on conjecture, and I'm definitely putting 1 and 1 together and coming up with 3 here. So if it's wrong, I apologise. As I said, I'm just kind of guessing. Then again, there is a potential that it is for Sony or for both vendors, because one of the demos from AdShare does actually feature Spider-Man, or at least a character that looks an awful lot like Spider-Man, running around the streets. So it's very difficult to tell. If I had to guess so far, Microsoft would make sense purely on their decision to push titles to the previous generation, but I'm basing that with no knowledge of what Sony are going to be doing with their plans going forward with releasing games on both generations. So it is possible it's for both vendors, and it's just as possible that it is purely for Sony. Moving on to the CPU side of the equation, of course, Zen 2, they reiterated several times in the event, is doing extremely well. Getting close to Intel's single-thread performance, but Intel does have the advantage in certain workloads purely because of clock frequency. But, of course, when it comes to sheer performance because of core count, AMD just are absolutely wrecking Intel currently. And the company also stressed that, just like their GPUs, they are not going to be slowing down the push for higher performance. Zen 3 is going to launch this year, and it's going to have, of course, numerous performance advantages over Zen 2. AMD are not too forthcoming about the performance improvements for Zen 3, although I have gone into Zen 3's IPC gains and clock frequency gains based upon what I've learned anyway, so I'll try to remember to link those in the video description. We will see these CPUs come out at least in 2 flavours. One will be for the server, and of course we will also see the Ryzen 4000 series. Just as a quick reminder, the Ryzen 4000 series will also mark the end of the AM5 platform, after which we will, at least according to my sources anyway, be shifting to AM5, and that will bring with it a myriad of different performance enhancements. I'm hearing this is going to include DDR5 support, and potentially higher core counts. So from what I understand anyway, Ryzen 4000 will not increase the core counts. This is for a couple of reasons. 1, Intel are not being competitive enough at the moment, and 2, bandwidth concerns. Whereas the next generation platform probably will increase the core count, although, once again, that will depend on several factors, not least of which is how competitive is Intel at that time. There is still an awful lot of questions for Zen 4 and what we will see with Zen 4. It's going to be built on the 5nm process according to this CPU roadmap here, and it will certainly mark a fundamental shift as well in most likely how AMD will need to worry about the market. Theoretically, by that point, Intel should have some really good competition out. That is, assuming they can continue to execute on their roadmap as they promise, which, well, let's just say that confidence in Intel's ability to execute has not exactly been at an all-time high recently, but I do think that there's a reasonable chance that we will see impressive results with, let's say, Willow Cove and so on. I have done a more in-depth analysis of what Intel most likely will be doing to counter AMD. I'll try to remember to link it in the video description. Focusing for just a moment longer on Zen 3, there are some things that AMD accidentally confirmed, kind of an oopsie-daisy, thanks to an overview and a video that was posted on YouTube and then very quickly removed. We still have 64 cores with 2 threads per core, and the power consumption for these CPUs is very similar to that of Rome. So, unfortunately, we only have Milan here, which is, just to be really abundantly clear, that is for server. But you will also notice a second slide that came out, and this particular slide is super interesting because it shows a comparison of the Rome and Milan die. This is obviously an MCM again, but here, the Zen 2 processors, we can see the 16 megabytes of level 3 cache is bifurcated. This is obviously per chiplet, whereas with Milan, it seems to be unified and states it's 32 megabytes plus. That's obviously a pretty good indicator that we will see more cache for Zen 3 compared to that of Milan, but as always, wait for the official release date. Now, when it comes to Zen 2, there was about a 15% IPC gain from the previous architecture, Zen 1. So from my information, and please bear in mind that the information does date back till December of last year, I'll link it below in the description of the video. But from my understanding, excuse me, Zen 3 has around a 10% improvement in integer performance over Zen 2. In some tasks it can be a little bit higher, but I'm going to err on the side of caution here. But floating point performance can be up to 50% faster. On average though, I've been told by a couple of people that it's around 15% to 17% gain again. So obviously performance gains will vary depending on what code is being run. And a couple of people have told me that it's comfortably in the double digits. One person who's really kind of knowledgeable in this has told me that it's in double digits, but he won't give me an exact figure. And we will of course see the launch of the X670 platform. The release date, from everything I know, is going to be Q4, but that was basically confirmed by AMD themselves. They said by the end of the year. Clock frequency, I'm less certain of. I've heard it's not a huge leap. I wouldn't be surprised if it's around 100 megahertz, maybe 200 if you're doing very well, but I could be totally wrong with that. And of course, TDP is very similar to what we have now, and also to my understanding it's still AVX 256, not AVX 512 support. And so that's just about it for this video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, you found it informative. If you did, then of course leave a like on the video because it helps us out a ton in YouTube land, and also subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon because YouTube and subscribing is just not enough anymore. You can also find us on social media, which is linked in the video description, as well as Patreon. If you want to support us that way, that would be great. Although you can also find Amazon affiliate links, so if you want to support us and contribute, but you want something for your hard-earned money, you can buy something via Amazon if you're planning to anyway, and that does give us a few pennies. With all of that said though, thank you very much for watching the video. I appreciate your support. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.